Hello, everyone, and welcome to our Native Initiatives webinar series. Today's webinar features Dr. Sweeney Winchief, who will be discussing mentoring in his webinar titled Co-Creating Community, Implementing an Indigenous Mentoring Plan. My name is Dr. Daryl Monto, and I am the SACNAS Native Initiatives Manager. We are so glad that you joined us today. This month, our webinar series is focused on how we can best serve and work with our Native American and Indigenous STEM students. We are always taking suggestions for future webinars. If you have any ideas, you can email me at daryl@sacnas.org. And at this time, I'm going to share my screen. Just got a little PowerPoint presentation here. Some slides with some important information. All right, and you can see my email address again at the bottom, daryl@sacnas.org. I want to take a brief moment to welcome our first-time attendees to SACNAS. We are a fully inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM, where the field, including leadership positions, reflects the demographics of the population. As the nation's largest multicultural and multidisciplinary STEM diversity organization in the country, SACNAS creates space where all members, volunteers, and partners feel they belong and can embrace their intersectional identities. If you're not yet, we invite you to join SACNAS as a member. Membership gives you access to a welcoming community of like-minded students and professionals from all STEM disciplines, including the opportunity to connect with one of our 118 chapters across the country. Eligibility to apply for programs specifically for each stage of your education or career. Exclusive opportunities like jobs, internships, and more from our partners, and an opportunity to raise your voice for true diversity and inclusion in STEM. You can sign up by visiting sacnas.org/memberships. We have a few housekeeping rules to review. If you have any questions throughout the panel portion of this webinar, please submit them via the chat feature, and we will answer as many questions as we can toward the end of this presentation. Remember to always be polite and respectful to others with your comments. If you have any additional questions that we don't get to, please stay to the end of this webinar to see how you can continue the conversation in the SACNAS online community. Now let's get started. It is my pleasure to introduce today's guest presenter, Dr. Sweeney Winchief. Sweeney comes from the Fort Peck Assiniboine tribe from Montana and currently serves as an associate professor of adult and higher education at Montana State University. His research interests include higher education, specifically under the umbrella of Indigenous intellectualism. His teaching privileges include critical race theory, Indigenous methodologies in research, law and policy in higher education, and institutional research. He and his wife, Sarah, have 2 sons who help keep things in perspective. Thank you for taking time to be with us today, Sweeney. And at this time, I'm going to turn it over to you.
My pleasure. It's an honor to be able to share in this conversation. I looked through the names and know a couple of you, and it's nice to see you be a part of this. I'm trying to share my screen. This is the host.
Okay.
Is there any way we can enable participant screen sharing?
Are you able to now?
Let me try it. Yep. Can you see that okay?
Yes.
All right. Hakuna bihinkna midagayabi. Chaje mitawat tangatogahe hinkna. Sweeney Winchief Jr. washijubi magiam. Mie Womawashi at Montana State University, Hinkna Wayaba Tibino Itanchan. I shared, I was asking some uncles, and they're like, anytime you present, start in your language. So I just gave a common introduction in the Assiniboine language. That's for, I think, personal reasons. I think anytime we share our language, we're breathing life into it. But I also think it's important that we encourage others to use those languages because there is knowledge couched in our Indigenous languages. I don't have a typical land acknowledgement. My land acknowledgement is a critique of my coming from a land grant institution. A lot of people will brag about being land grant institutions and serving the people. And it's a cautious critique because I think if we can reimagine what land grants were and how they were established as the result of displacement of Indigenous peoples, but since that time, our institutions have developed. So they've moved beyond infrastructure, resource management, military training, et cetera, into places where we now have arts and humanities at these land grant institutions. So if we can reimagine curriculum, land grant institutions can certainly reimagine the way that they engage with Indigenous peoples. I want to recognize the Itancha, or the leadership, and recognize them and all of you in your places of influence and leadership for serving Indigenous peoples through your scholarship. And finally, again, thank you for the invitation to share and engage some of our work. Just so you know who's talking to you, my name is Sweeney Winchief. I grew up primarily off reservation. I'm an enrolled Fort Peck Assiniboine tribal member, but during the school year, I was primarily raised in Wyoming. In the summers, we would spend back with my grandparents on the Fort Peck reservation, and they had a ranch, and they didn't let us go to town very much, so it was pretty isolating out there. I was a community college participant. My avenue into higher education was through athletics in the community college system. If you looked at my transcripts, I've got 7 different institutions on my transcripts. So if you want to know how to get into school, come talk to me. I've had a lot of practice. So my junior college, community college experience was at Northwest College in Wyoming. I transferred to the University of Central Oklahoma for my bachelor's degree, attended the University of Montana for my master's in counselor education degree, and did my doctorate at the University of Utah in educational leadership and policy. Got 2 lively, rambunctious sons. His pictures are pretty dated. They're 12 and 14 now, and that's my wife, Sarah. So there's also an academic protocol at play, and anybody that's worked with grants recognizes that you need to acknowledge the funding that supported your research. And so this large statement on the right, I'm not going to read it word for word, but I do want to draw your attention to the bolded print near the bottom. Any opinions, findings, and conclusions or recommendations expressed in this material are those of the authors and do not necessarily reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. Not quite sure when they will reflect the views of the National Science Foundation. There's a couple of caveats when we talk about mentoring, and particularly American Indian Alaska Native students at predominantly white institutions. We're working within a contemporary context, but we're also cognizant, we want to be cognizant of both the Western academic paradigm and Indigenous knowledge realization. So in this Venn diagram, it's my goal to stay focused on the very center of this graphic. The second caveat is contextual, right? I'll be describing an Indigenous mentoring program, but we have to recognize the place-based nature of Indigenous identity. We also, one of our tribal college partners, Emma Norman at Northwest Indian College, told us, she's like, you don't have the time and energy to make this required of your faculty. She said, start with those who have an interest in mentoring Native students, those that are currently mentoring Native students, and those that have had past success in mentoring Native students. And so that's part of our caveat as well. This isn't something that we mandate. We could under Indian Education for All legislation and Montana constitutional law, but that's where we're starting. We also want to recognize that this is designed for a predominantly white institution. There is institutional variability, and the idea behind the Indigenous mentoring program is to take what's useful in your given context, in your specific institution. So if somebody were going to do this at a tribal college, for instance, it would look different, and it should. It's not a canned program. And then the last one is to recognize that students, Indigenous faculty, Indigenous student support services staff, everybody is on this idea of an Indigenous identity continuum, right? So on one hand, you have students who are incredibly knowledgeable about who they are and where they come from. They speak the language, they may carry community-held knowledge in the form of ceremony, for instance. They know their genealogy. They might know your genealogy and how you're related. They understand clan systems, etc. On the other side of this continuum, right, there's students, faculty, Indigenous students and faculty who all they know is that one of their grandparents told them that they're part Native. And it's no fault of their own that that's the case. That's the assimilation machine at work. And as a result, we don't see everybody in between these two places as in a deficit model discourse. We see individuals on this continuum as potential community contributors or in recognition of their contribution to Indigenous community. All right, so there's a couple of things that I'm not going to do. Again, not enter that deficit model discourse. That's happened in Indigenous research far too often, starting with a problem statement and generalizing to a complete distinct people. I'm not going to participate in the Olympics of the oppressed. I want to recognize that, yes, we've experienced a lot of trauma, historical and intergenerational trauma, but I'm not going to highlight that trauma. I'm not going to minimize or avoid place-based knowledge. So some of you are joining from the American Southwest, some from the Pacific Northwest, some are joining from urban centers, etc. And these are all places of Indigenous interaction that need to be acknowledged as such. And I'm not going to act as the keeper of anyone's Indigenous identity, right? There are multiple racial purity checks that sometimes are a part of or a result of lateral oppression. And so I'm not here to decide who is and who isn't, and who will be and who won't be an Indigenous person. And finally, I'm not going to ignore relationality. I don't have access right now. I can't see folks or the chat, but I know that there's some folks on here that I know, and it's good to see you. It's good to see all of you. So one of the things that I learned, I don't know, several years ago, and passed to my current students is this concept of PSA. And I learned this from Americans for Indian Opportunity, a nonprofit based in Albuquerque, New Mexico, as one of their fellows. So this PSA is a public service announcement. It's purpose, solution, action, or it's problem, solution, action. So to be very clear, the root of this project is to increase American Indian and Alaskan Native graduate participation in STEM. And when we thought about the most impactful thing that we could do in improving access and the maintenance of cultural integrity while navigating these predominantly white spaces, is to develop appropriate mentoring experiences for our students. And in order to do that, we have to address the faculty. So the action part of this is that anybody that's engaged in our Indigenous mentoring program, we're charging them to participate and contribute, to think proactively about a plan, and to get those activities on their calendar so that they're not going to be taken up by their other responsibilities. The concept behind the mentoring program starts with our population, American Indians and Alaska Natives in STEM. Now, we critique traditional mentoring a little bit, the top-down sort of hierarchical structure of it. We reformulated that and borrowed from a model at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. And one's a mutual mentoring model and one's a multiple mentoring model. We wanted to add to that Indigenous values and voice. And so that is where the research part came in. We recognize the literature in relationality and responsibility in those relationships. We borrow from Dr. Iris Heavy Runner's family education model, and we again recognize that students, all participants, faculty, staff, are someplace located on that identity continuum, and that place is fluid. So if I were to define an Indigenous mentoring program, the whole idea is to avoid the crisis of relevance. How can we make this scholarship, these STEM, science, technology, engineering, and math relevant by implementing Indigenous lived realities? We want to reimagine mentoring, and not only want students to be successful in that navigation, but we want them to maintain or strengthen their own concept of cultural integrity. Finally, the definition, one of the defining components of our program, is moving from that concept of rugged individualism that we see so often in STEM and the medical fields, to moving from I graduate to we graduate, which is a paradigm shift for the majority of STEM fields. So if we look at traditional academic mentoring, particularly in graduate school, think about the way that mentors may think about their students. And if they're thinking of their students as disciples, these students, it's our hypothesis, that they're the ones that wind up being all but dissertation and then turn into the mentor's harshest critics. But if we reimagine and start thinking about them as mentee, we're thinking of not about cloning themselves. That is certainly some faculty want to do that. They want to clone themselves in scholarship. And if they do that, those students who are soon to be their colleagues are going to be at risk of forever being seen as the clone of their mentor. If the mentor sees their mentee as a protege, they're going to have difficulty furthering methods, techniques, theories that their committee chairs or their PIs have already established. But if we start thinking about our students as peers, this is where they become standalone scholars. All right, so I'm going to move past this one. Time's chipping away at us, but I want to think about the graduate student's perspective. And this is implementing William Perry's forms of ethical and intellectual development. Right, so they go through these stages from dualism to commitment to multiplicity to relativism with commitment. Or commitment with relativism. So I'm just going to start with the first one, right? When students first come into the program, they're going to see their mentor as they know everything, right? And that everybody else is uninformed. And hopefully through the process, they develop through these forms to the end where they have commitment with relativism, and internally they're able to say, I have my own research agenda and I'm cognizant about how it diverges from my mentors. So when we did our research, the key themes that came out were, and I want to draw your attention to the one that came out the most. So if we look in the lower left-hand corner that says relationality, and the one just above that, the majority of responses that we came through our research were related to relationality, and not surprisingly, barriers to relationality more so than relationality itself. Right, and we were talking before this webinar started about relationality, and we're looking forward to those relationships between mentors and students and the co-constructor of the broader community to be organic, right? It's not something that's forced. This is something that takes informal get-togethers. Anybody that works in American Indian Student Services, Native Student Services, realizes the power of bringing people together for something as simple as dinner, for instance, in order for those relationships to develop. So the other ones, I'll start at the top right, cultural humility, right? How is it that we can get our mentors to humble up a little bit and make themselves open to learning about their students and their lived realities? A lot of people wanted pragmatic suggestions for activities, both students, faculty, and staff. People were wanting to include Indigenous worldviews in their experiences, and people were also looking for really easy to understand resources and support. So based on our findings, we created a 9-module training that's gone several places. It's not just within our PNW Cosmos Collaborative right now. But these 9 learning modules originally were shared in 2014, maybe 2015, but we wanted our mentors to be able to create self-location statements, and we wanted to provide an introduction to different Indigenous mentoring models. This wasn't limited to the Plains area medicine wheel peoples in North America. This included examples from Hawaiian perspectives, examples from Maori perspectives in New Zealand. So we wanted to help people reimagine what Indigenous mentoring looks like. We had a seminar on Indigenous research methodologies. I should say Indigenous methodologies in research, because they're 2 distinct things. We wanted our faculty to be familiar with the services that were available to American Indians and Alaska Natives on their respective campuses, so that they didn't have to feel like they were recreating the wheel, or they knew that there was some support that could meet the unique needs of our students. Interestingly, both faculty and students thought it was important that the faculty visit the students' home communities. But we learned also that this should happen only by invitation. This should happen in a relationship. It's not just a matter of us busing a bunch of faculty to Browning, Montana, for instance, and getting off and hanging out at the gas station and getting them back saying they visited the community. This is by the student's invitation. And we've had some legitimate life-changing experiences for some of our faculty who've taken that invitation and gone and visited students. They speak much better about their experiences than I can. The faculty wanted interface. They wanted to know where they could find their prospective students, right? They seemed a little bit uninformed about the multiple programs that are happening out there for students, American Indian students in STEM. SACNAS, ACES, AHEC, these different organizations that they need to learn and develop a relationship with so that they're able to recruit. We had a whole session on informal gatherings, right? How can we get faculty and American Indian, Alaska Native students and their families together? So once a month, we have a student or a scholar only gathering through our program. We have a faculty only gathering, and then we have once a month gathering with everybody, and they're informal. We'll meet at a farmer's market, or we'll meet someplace on campus, and it's just a matter of like hanging out and providing space for people to get together. In some cases, if somebody's getting ready to present their research, we'll have students give their presentations and have students and faculty alike critique them. The next one is presentation of research to community leaders. And this is both for the student and the faculty. Like, how can that faculty present their research to Indigenous communities and community leaders in a way that is meaningful to the community and not all of academia. We've had students, they've presented their master's thesis, for instance, or their dissertations, both in the academic forum on campus, and they'll take it back home and present it to their tribal council, for instance, or their council of elders. And then last, people wanted access to the literature on specifically mentoring American Indians and Alaska Native students. So there's a couple of things that I would like to highlight as examples of the way that we're reframing and rethinking mentorship. So I recognize that this is community specific. So I'm not speaking on behalf of all Indians who ever lived, are now living, or ever will live. This is specifically an Assiniboine kinship structure that I'm going to describe. And I take this information seriously because for me, it holds water on the cultural side of things. This gentleman on the left, Dr. Kenneth Ryan, was the one that shared this with me in person. And then one of my committee members literally interviewed him and wrote that paper and got it published. So this is both Indigenous knowledge and knowledge that's published in academia. To me, that's the best kind of knowledge. It holds water. So I want everybody to think about their own families, and in this Assiniboine kinship model, and similar to others, but there are differences. Your mom is your mom, but so are her sisters, right? If something happens and your mom can't be a mom, that responsibility in a traditional context would fall to her sisters. And your dad is your dad, but so are his brothers. So for instance, I don't have any biological brothers. You see these two guys in the upper right-hand corner, they're able to serve as dad likes in the language. It translates to like my dad. They're able to serve that role. Your mom's brothers are your teasing uncles. So they're the ones that tease you till you cry and then tease you for crying when you're little. And when you get, you grow up and have your own family, it doesn't end there. They still tease you. But there's a utility in that teasing, right? You can go anywhere in the world. And if somebody has good teasing uncles and somebody else gives them a hard time, then it's water off a duck's back. It's not going to bother you. Those teasing uncles also, it's their job to know your accomplishments and to speak on your behalf so that you don't have to brag for yourself. Now, that's your mom's brothers. Your dad's sisters are the disciplinarians. In this traditional structure, they would have discretion, and rather than the parents disciplining the child, that would happen from your dad's sister, and she has discretion over how she does that. In a contemporary context, right? We're intertribal, we're urban, we're reservation, we're in tribal colleges, we're in predominantly white institutions, and this is going to be different. The more intertribal that it gets, we have to weave a network of and figure out along the way how it is that we're related. So I guess my best way of expressing this, and it's important for our students to find something. It doesn't have to be this model. Hopefully, in a best case scenario, the model is one that comes from the student's community of origin, so that internally, and this borrows from Baxter Magolda's self-authorship work, but internally, they're able to recognize their place in their academic lineage. So this guy right here was my committee chair. His name's Octavio Villalpando. To the left of him is Dr. Danny Solorzano at UCLA. These are the academic elders. This is Dwayne Champagne, also at UCLA. I see them as our academic elders. And then we have our own, much closer to us, committee members. So these are my 3 committee members, but then I went to school and developed fictive kinships with other students. And these are just 2 examples. One is Dr. Brian Hotchkins, who's now on the tenure track at Texas Tech. And the other one is Victor Narsamulu. He's from Rotuma. He's a current PhD student at the University of Utah. But we're also mentoring others, right? And they need to learn how to make these internal connections. Whoops, I'm sorry. How to make these internal connections. There's utility in this. If I find an academic relative that has this same or similar lineage, chances are methods, theories, techniques, community commitments are going to be similar. And those are people that you can engage in this space with. So another example is developing for students their own mentoring constellations. Right? Who are the ones that they mentor upwards? In the cases of STEM, some of our students are going to be mentoring in a cultural way their academic committee chairs. They're also going to be mentoring the students who are going to be in their shoes the next year. And then they've also got external peer mentors at home, but also internal peer mentors here on campus. So we want to put students in the center so that they're able to rethink their relationships and how, again, moving from I graduate to we graduate. And to do that in a way that's in alignment with who they are as a cultural person. What Indigenous context are they coming from, and how can they make sense of it in a way that aligns with their cultural congruence. Okay, so I'm curious. We've got a little bit of time. We could certainly bump over to questions, but I am interested in others' ideas or examples that would work in a place-based context or a culture-based context. bump over and see if I can't see there's a lot of chats. Has anybody, yeah, I'm asking for people reimagining mentoring in their context. What can it look like given different identity continuum locations, different place-based knowledge spheres, etc. Or questions?
There was a question way up in the chat.
Oh, Melody raised a hand. Does Melody have access? Is she able to?
So that was by mistake.
Oh, okay.
Okay. There was a question up in the chat earlier from Amy Markle.
Okay.
And she says, aloha, question for discussion. How to mold mentoring programs outside of the normal college education system? What are some suggestions for mentoring youth and young adults for monitoring and observation? Or other programs outside of typical school programs?
You know, that's a great question. I think that the closer we can get to community, if we have tribal community in urban centers or close to our institutions, I think it's a really good start to start with that identity component. One of the things that I think is really impactful, and I actually learned this in this model in Hawaii, so it might be most beneficial, but one of my Hawaiian sisters has a nonprofit organization, and she explained mentoring as you have the person themselves, the doer, but then you've got, you need to have an elder, right, for everything that you do. And the reason that you have an elder is they're, of course, going to guide you, but if your voice doesn't carry and the elder can state your message and agrees with it, and they say it, people will listen, right? And she also said it's important to have a younger person with you, so that if you need to be two places in once, say for instance, you're giving a presentation or teaching a class, and but you're also responsible for feeding people, you can hand that younger person your credit card and your keys and say, this is how many people we have, this is what we need to do, and send them. By including them, you're mentoring them. And then she said, more importantly, that it's yes, there's the utility in it, but the important part is that's knowledge coming through our elders, through us, and into the next generation. So it was a really a clear reimagining for me, and something that if we could help students make that internal shift and recognize that sort of lineage of knowledge transfer, we would be able to we would be more successful in navigating predominantly white institutions using our own community stuff.
Now you've got a comment from Carmen. I'm working with a group of faculty who will use innovation and specifically community-based needs to motivate STEM interest. Students will be mentored by faculty in innovation, STEM, and student support services. And then we have a question. Due to the lack of Native men in college, do you have any suggestions on tailored Indigenous strategies to engage men in college?
That is a really great question. I mean, the whole thrust behind this was to address Stephen Abbott's crisis of relevance, right? And to share a story about my own situation and crisis, that crisis of relevance. As soon as I got to done with my comprehensive exams, I felt like I was selling out. Like, am I becoming assimilated as a result of this process? And I literally took a month and just read Indigenous scholars, both North America, Pacific Islands, South America, if it was translated into English, Canadian scholars, just to see how, in particular, men used their identity, or in some cases didn't use their identity in their scholarship. And it's not as simple as if you do, it's good, if you don't, it's bad. It's how you do it, right? How are you being true to yourself, but also making those connections to science? And while I was doing that, I read a paper by Manulani Myers in Hawaii. She's a Native Hawaiian scholar. And she literally in one of her writings says, how you move through the space that you're in tells us a lot about you. But she left it abstract enough that I read it like this was my relatives saying that, right? How you move through this academic space tells us a lot about you, our relatives that have passed on. And that to me freed me up to do okay and be like, and to actually do well in academia, because that's how it's reflective on how they want to see me be successful. So it sort of it opened the door to be able to do this work and not feel bad about it.
I believe you kind of mentioned something on this next question, regarding this next question. The comment, you are fortunate to be at an institution with a big critical mass of Native mentors and mentees. What advice do you have for those at predominantly white institutions?
Well, I would say we are privileged to have some things on our side, right, at Montana State University. Not one of our mentors, not one of our STEM mentors is an Indigenous person. And I think the best way to explain that inclusion is to figure out who's mentoring our students and have someone from our group go and visit with them. Like, just check in, hey, how's it going with the student, etc. You should come to dinner with us, right? So we'll host these monthly dinners. And if mentors don't want to engage with their student there because they're weird about the power differential or whatever, they could just come to the mentor dinner, right? If students want to just meet with other students and take a break from the academic side of things, they can certainly just come and meet with the other students. And so that provides a pretty welcoming environment. Most of the faculty see each other in their circles of influence, but they also get to re-engage in a more casual and way that's in alignment with their students, even if their students aren't at that meeting. So I do see a question in 9 learning modules. Yeah, they're absolutely accessible. In fact, we've created a guide and it's free and open to the public. I can shoot the link to the list that was signed up for this, or just send it to you, Daryl. Would that be okay?
Yeah, for sure. We will be sending out this recording to everyone who signed up for today's webinar, and we'll also include Sweeney's contact information and any other materials that he wants to send to share with those that are viewing and not able to view today. So yes.
So before we take any other questions, there's really something I want to bounce off of the group, and I see another couple of questions on there that we can get to.
Really good questions.
Let's see. So one of the things that helps our faculty is to re-engage their concept of cultural competence. Right, cultural competence is a super Western way of viewing what I think of as cultural humility, or what's found in the literature as cultural humility. So the idea of competence, and it's not a bad thing. I think that cultural competence can be a stepping stone toward better mentorship for our students. But I think that there's some things that we can grow upon and turn it into we can build upon and turn it into a lifelong learning sort of situation. So on the left-hand side, we have cultural competence, right, which is grounded in ethnocentrism. Of course, it values diversity, right? There is the capacity for self-assessment. If you're at an institution of higher education, chances are there's been a campus climate study that's been a part of that. That's the capacity for self-assessment. It's being conscious of the dynamics that happen when two different groups or subgroups of students and faculty get together. And I think to some degree, it can be problematic, but it seeks to institutionalize cultural knowledge. And that doesn't, I've got a lot of criticisms of folks that try to institutionalize cultural knowledge. And then finally, as far as mentoring goes, it reflects an understanding of the diversity between and within cultures. Now, if we reframe that in more of a circular way, right, and we look at cultural humility, which is grounded in ethno-relativism, we see that there's a capacity for cultural humbleness. And we ask our faculty to tell us about times when they screwed up in a cultural context. And in order to start that conversation, we have to share stories about some things that we did in different cultures that was just a no-fly zone. We then hope that our faculty and we have conversations around developing their understanding of Indigenous contributions to their field. We hope that they recognize that there's some knowledge that's not appropriate to record or write down. And if they find themselves in those situations, to be humble enough to just to step away. Finally, we want them to develop relationships and start to value the distinction, what makes different tribes distinct. So we all know that being Indigenous is not a monolithic experience, right? Being Indigenous is reflective of cultural and community distinct practices, values, social mores, etc., which then in turn feeds back into the system and makes room for that capacity for cultural humbleness. So in order to do that, I take our faculty out. We did this once and it worked out really great. But I took all of our STEM faculty. These are all STEM faculty holding up this teepee structure. And that's me helping, but I gave them rules. They asked for my help. So I give them a couple of rules: no phones, no YouTube, no Googling, don't cut my poles, don't cut my rope, don't cut my stakes. And I gave them 1 hour to set it up. And this prompted some really great conversation. They had to work together. They recognized that some of this knowledge isn't something that they're going to read in books, but it can only be experienced. A lot of people were impressed with, and one of them was an engineer. He was impressed with the old school, quote unquote, nature of it, but he was also had some conversation that we didn't understand about fluid dynamics. And then it led to some conversations around cultural nuance, like why does the door fit a particular way? I heard this tribe uses 4 poles and another tribe uses 3 poles. So it started to develop people's awareness around cultural distinction from tribes that are relatively close to one another. So this was an example of how we're trying to get our faculty to recognize cultural humility. And then last but not least, we're rethinking different ways of knowing. So epistemological pluralism is just that. It's a fancy academic way of saying different ways of knowing. And our goal here is making scholarship accessible, meaningful, and culturally responsive. So what you're seeing now is a poster presentation that we just submitted to walk people through exclusion and erasure, problematic inclusion, theoretical sensitivity. This one right here is cultural intuition, and then the realization of, or I'm sorry, Indigenous knowledge realization. So that was super fast, and I know we're really bumping up against time, but I'm happy to, talk some more if you've got time. If not, I absolutely understand.
We've got some time, more time. You've got some questions, more questions that came up in the chat. So I'll just quickly go through and kind of share a few of those. And again, for those that, if we don't get to your question, Just please know that we will be sending out Sweeney's information, contact information, and you can definitely reach out to him there. So this one's thanking you for sharing your knowledge, and they are wanting to, they're asking, how can we further mentor and engage students on a virtual or remote setting? We are a nonprofit and wanting to develop a mentoring program out of our national office, which may be tricky due to where the mentee applicants may come from. So they're asking about a virtual remote mentoring.
Yeah, we've had some difficulty with that too, and I think it's related to the pandemic and how everybody's shifted to being in a more online environment. And the things that are working for us are to get it on people's schedules and remind them. And conversations take a little bit longer to develop in that context, but they eventually happen. I think incentivizing in some way, like finding what's important about these and rechecking in with both students and faculty, what's important to them about these meetings, and being reactive to that, being flexible to change our agenda to really better serve our students and faculty members.
All right, and we have another question here. Can you speak about approaching the systemic challenges with mentoring? You mentioned comprehensive tests, which can be a huge challenge in my field, and their field was mathematics, and can lead to low retention.
There's a lot of really, and that's a hot topic right now too. There's a lot of research coming out. I think it's Casey Miller and Julie Posselt have got a lot of really good resources that are supportive of holistic admissions review, even in the STEM fields. So institutions like Purdue University removed the GRE from their admissions application. And I think that if those resources are there and institutions haven't made those changes, those resources could be brought into particular departmental application processes and shared with members. Like if we can't exclude this person because this test wasn't written for them, right? They do a really good job of breaking down and justifying, breaking down the GRE and are convincing in that it's not related to student success in doctoral education. Let's see, did I get to all of that question?
Approaching the systemic challenges with mentoring, yeah. So another question that we have that came in, do you have any ideas on incentivizing mentoring? And they state that their faculty already have so much on their plates, and that's kind of what we were talking about before we get started.
It's a super tough one. One of the things that we learned along the way was not just incentivizing mentoring, but incentivizing like good mentoring. And it includes some hard conversations sometimes. But as far as the incentive goes to participate in our program, we have most of our participants are junior faculty or those who have yet to attain the rank of tenure. And it's because of a structural thing that we have on our campus. We operate through the Center for Faculty Excellence, which records your participation in any training that you do, and it automatically gets uploaded to your online CV that the institution operates their faculty review under, right? And so just by participating in this, you get like X number of hours toward your own professional development that works toward tenure. So that's a big incentive for anybody that's pre-tenured. And I think that we have to be a little bit cautious about the whole strategic interest convergence that happens sometimes. I think sometimes faculty want to do research in Indigenous communities, and they might problematically see the students as a way of being able to do that, right? So we want to confront that right away. So we're not extractive of community information or using these relationships in order to further our own research agenda. So those are conversations that we have. I think it's a little bit like, and right now we've been fairly well established, but it's a little bit like a snowball dance in the 7th grade, right? Where they would stop the music and you had to go find somebody else. And they'd stop it again. And then those two people had to go find somebody else. So we're asking our mentors, the ones that are through in the program or have gone through it, to recommend others that they think would find it beneficial. And it's on campus here in our partner institutions. It's found a way to grow and become institutionalized. We're really proud of that, but it did take a good 6 years worth of work to get to where we're at.
All right, couple more questions and then we will wrap up. One person, James, is asking if you can link or repeat the name of the Hawaiian scholars who considered how one moves through a space.
Dr. Manulani Aluli Meyer. If you Google Manu, M-A-N-U, and Meyer, M-E-Y-E-R, she is one of the most powerful women I've ever had the privilege of spending time in space with. She was a legitimate game changer for me, and she's got it.
All right, and I think this will be our last question. This was an excellent presentation. Thank you. As a woman in STEM, I have seen many examples of harassment of students by mentors during informal gatherings. Now that I'm a mentor of many students myself, I have been adamant about keeping interactions with my students strictly formal. Should I be rethinking this approach, particularly in my interactions with my Indigenous students?
So we talked a little bit about this as well, but we've had faculty that came through our program and really bought in, like really worked hard to develop a trusting relationship with their student. And they, as a result of their experience with their students, they needed to rethink their boundaries. The student had some mental health issues, and our faculty mentor was really going above and beyond and trying to fulfill the role of a community, just as one person. And I mean, it's a really good thing. I think each mentoring engagement and relationship is it's an ongoing professional relationship, right? And those relationships change through time and should. So I don't think there's any hard, fast line, but I also don't think that we can throw professionalism out the window. I really appreciate that. It's certainly a case-by-case basis, and it's complicated given people's different dispositions and skill sets. So.
All right, well, we are coming toward the end of our today's webinar. And so again, we want to thank Sweeney for taking time. I know that this really wasn't enough time. I'm pretty sure that there's a lot more that could have been shared and discussed, and I'm sure a lot more questions too. But thank you so much. And as I've mentioned before, we will have this webinar recording available within the next week or two, along with contact information, and the modules will be shared as well. So so thank you for being able to share that. I just want to follow up with a few things. We want to hear from you. So immediately after this webinar is over, you will be directed to a brief survey, and we encourage you to provide feedback on today's program and suggest any future webinars, webinar topics that you might have. And if you enjoyed today's webinar, you can find upcoming and previous webinars on our website at sacness.org/webinars. This concludes our visit with Sweeney Winchief. Thank you for taking time to join us, and we hope that you have a wonderful rest of your week. Thank you, everyone. Have a good afternoon.